And you have to remember, in the early days, even up until the last 10, 15 years, there weren't great options for universal donor banks like ourselves as a supplier to clinics, hospitals, research groups, etc. And so these doctors literally had a little room in their back office, a little lab, if you want to call it that even, where they would have a donor and they would mix stuff up and they would just shoot it into the colonoscopy.
Welcome to another episode of Biome Breakthroughs, and today we are going to take a little bit of a different spin. We talk a lot about the research behind FMT or fecal microbiota transplantation, or about the impacts of gut health in different conditions. But today we're going to take a dive into where would you start? How do you build out a protocol? How do these studies approach different conditions in terms of applying FMT? We want you to get an idea of where it to be less daunting, get an idea of the first steps you need to take to really understand how to implement FMT, either with other, treatments that you're doing or as a standalone.
This is great. Yeah. And I think, FMT was most broadly used up until, the last while. It's expanding as it relates to how much research is happening with a whole bunch of different conditions. But primarily the bulk of the data is around C. diff. And the protocol for treating C. diff has always been really short. Single colonoscopy, originally, one or two enemas, some capsules, and the types of protocols varied slightly, but they were generally built around a very short protocol. And the results with these very short protocols were phenomenal. Like, the patients get great cure rates in C. diff. The trouble is that in research following that, the protocols were really designed around the C. diff protocol, which was really short. And so there was a time where we were thinking like, well, wait a minute, FMT doesn't really seem to work for X condition or Y condition. But the reality is that the protocol was just not appropriate for the disease and how the disease presented and the physiology and whatnot. So we're realizing more and more that these very short, abbreviated C. diff protocols don't work for all conditions. And so that's really exciting to see that the research is beginning to catch up in the last 5-10 years. The protocols are getting a little more, longer and extended, and different researchers and in clinical practice, people are trying different approaches, as well as the technology for manufacturing and processing FMT changes and evolves over time, which we've been a part of here at Novel Biome. So yeah, I'm excited to cover this topic because it brings up a lot of questions for doctors, and our role is to play a role in educating. And my background being as a naturopathic doctor who treated hundreds of patients, I'm hoping today to bring some of my clinical experience and insights when I was treating patients into this discussion.
And I think before we dive in to kind of, heighten what Jason's saying about the history here, one of the big breakthroughs in changing how we approach treating with FMT was the creation of FMT capsules. And I think if you're new to the field, you don't realize how new they truly are. They really only came onto the scene around 2019. And you have to remember, a lot of other crazy things happened around that time that really impacted the growth of FMT and its applications, because there were restrictions around COVID and screening and understanding what we needed to account for there. So the growth of the use of capsules, I think, was slower than we would have seen if it had came out at a different time. But that approach really expands our access to different treatment lengths and courses. As well, when we're looking at different conditions, we're doing a lot of looking into right now IBS and SIBO to get a better understanding of that field. And that's the reason why this is my example, because I'm currently reading a lot about it. But there's actual studies that look at going, even just the amount used in a colonoscopy made a difference. The length of treatment made a difference. And so this is an area where people have been really getting into the nitty gritty of what is the best and what are the differences, even in sex differences. And I've only seen this in IBS, and I don't know if it's because it was probably the next kind of question that was asked after C. diff. But it's amazing, even IBS has many subtypes, so that's being looked at, as well as the length, as well as the type. And so it's a really interesting case study in the kind of growth of protocols looking specifically in this one disease. And I get the pleasure of looking at these diseases kind of isolated in terms of the research and watching it grow over time and how that approach changes. And I think it's really true that we're approaching each one knowing that this is a chronic condition, so an acute treatment is not going to be the solution here. And so I think that makes a big difference.
Right. And really the modern version of FMT, starting back in like the 50s and 60s, evolved to what it is today by a large part through the work of awesome gastroenterologists. And what do gastros do most days? They're either doing colonoscopies, endoscopies. And so their approach to treatment was in using the tools that they had. And you have to remember, in the early days, even up until the last 10, 15 years, there weren't great options for universal donor banks like ourselves as a supplier to clinics, hospitals, research groups, etc. And so these doctors literally had a little room in their back office, a little lab, if you want to call it that even, where they would have a donor and they would mix stuff up and they would just shoot it into the colonoscopy. Hopefully YouTube doesn't get mad at us, but one of the doctors who we work with was doing this back in the 80s. And he said back then they just called it a shit shake. And it was literally that. Like they took a stool, mixed it with some saline, shook it up, and applied it. And so it's really evolved. And in part now, there's more disciplines that are getting involved because the barrier to access isn't through colonoscopy or endoscopy or the other potential routes of administration. It could be as simple as oral capsules. And so that's, I think, a real opportunity for the broadening of its application as well. So you're right, around that time. That's also around the time that we began making the oral FMT capsules and then later the oral powders and so on.
So to take a spin from our normal, you're not just going to look at our beautiful faces today. We're going to pull up one of our protocol guides. And so this is our general guide. So this is the entrance into the concept of making a protocol. And we've tried to simplify it. And we will link it down below if you want to take a look. But again, always, if this is piquing your interest, please reach out to us so that we can give you a little bit more info.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a researcher, if you're a physician with a patient who's considering this, we're more than happy to share disease-specific protocols that we've created if they're available, or share research and studies that indicate protocols. And then, of course, layering on top of that some of our, clinical experience in treating patients with FMT over, 5+ years.
And we want to support everybody in kind of how do they start this process? And we want to give you guys our experience and our knowledge, but we also want to make sure that we're there to answer your questions. We want everyone to feel comfortable and really appreciate where this fits in. And so when we look at how you approach FMT, we always suggest a pre-treatment. We'll go into a little bit more about the pre-treatment after we get through kind of the protocol. But the idea here is we start with a gut prep, a bowel cleanse, and then depending on if it fits, fasting. And so there's always something that comes before starting the FMT. And then we get into actually doing FMT. And this is always divided into a loading dose and a maintenance dose. And I think what we want to get across is the importance of the loading dose. So this is a bolus dose of FMT. It's a large dose over 1 to 2 days. And what this is doing is it's helping to provide a large amount of these microbiota to help seed the gut and start the process of engraftment. And the goal here is to give enough so that you have enough to actually create that initial environment. And once this bolus is done, we move into a maintenance dose. These are smaller doses over an extended period of time. Part of this is to help with that seeding or that engraftment. But as well, there's a lot of after FMT changes, lifestyle changes, like expanding the diet, that happen after this loading dose. And so by doing the maintenance, it allows for extended seeding, extended kind of creating a strong environment. But as well, it allows for the lifestyle changes to happen so that you can support this new gut, because the same foods and the same lifestyle will not magically make a healthy gut if it wasn't healthy before. And so you have to support it. And so that's part of why extending the maintenance dose can be so important.
Right. And I'd love to jump into an analogy, but before I do that, I think another real advantage of this extended maintenance is because we don't really know exactly how FMT is working. it's not just the bacteria, it's not just the metabolites, it's not just it's the combination of everything. But I do think that the metabolites probably play a much larger role than we think. And so having these metabolites that are coming from this daily dose is helping moderate the environment of the gut such that it can create engraftment and healing and so on and so forth. And the way that I like to explain this, and a lot of people can probably relate to this analogy, is really, it's this concept of a garden, right? You're trying to plant a garden that's going to be, fruitful, grow vegetables or fruits or whatever you're trying to do. But the reality is that most people or patients who are coming to this treatment have a lot of dysbiosis, overgrowth. There's a lot of weeds, there's a lot of thistles, there's a lot of problems with both the plants that are growing in the soil and the quality of the soil itself. So it might be degraded, it might be nutrient deplete, it might be, there's problems in the soil. And so what can grow in problematic soil? Weeds. And so in the concept of the human gut, it's very similar, right? You start to get overgrowth of pathogens. You start to get few amounts of some species of bacteria overgrowing significantly. So they're not necessarily pathogenic, but they become problematic because there's just way too many of them. And a healthy gut microbiome has a lot of diversity. So there's a lot of different bacterias and a lot of them. And so that healthy balance is really important. So if you've got this garden that's full of weeds, that's overgrown, that's got unhealthy soil, what happens when you put a whole bunch of seeds in there? Well, nothing's going to happen because it's way too much for that new seed to come in and graft. The sun isn't able to get through. There's not a lot of spots for the actual seeds to land and sprout and grow. And even if some of them can, they'll quickly get out-competed. And so the whole concept behind this pre-treatment is really to wipe out as much as possible this overgrowth, get rid of these weeds, get rid of these imbalances, and create an environment where when we do this loading dose, we're putting in a whole bunch of seeds with this idea that we're actually going to allow a lot of them to take hold and grow. Now, if you did nothing, if you didn't plant a whole bunch of new seeds, quickly you're going to start to see an overgrowth of these weeds again. I mean, weeds grow. They love this environment. They love not having competition. And so they'll quickly sprout up. And so it's important to moderate the treatment as you're moving through. And so that's this idea of cleaning up the garden. You're then putting in this massive bolus dose so that you're not allowing this overgrowth of weeds and dysbiotic, overgrown, potentially pathogenic bacteria. And then the maintenance that we're talking about is this gentle daily reminder, okay, this is what a healthy microbiome looks like. It's almost like the fertilizer to a new garden, right? You're watering it, you're continuing to take care of it, especially when it's in this more vulnerable stage where the plants are still developing, they're still fragile, and too much or too little of something could really damage them. And so once they're engrafted and it's form this new healthy community, you've got less to worry about. It's not as problematic. But as Shana was pointing out, it's in this period of time that your patient, or if you are the patient, that you're able to then make some of these lifestyle changes that would have been hard to do or totally impossible to do, depending, right? It might be because you're dealing with, food allergies or sensitivities. It might be that there's challenges that are in the way of you making these changes. I mean, it could literally be an issue of, I have no energy. I've got chronic fatigue syndrome. I have no energy to get up, exercise. My sleep schedule is a total mess. I can't, go to the store to buy really healthy foods and make these nice foods. But as you begin to make improvements, you'll then start to see positive changes in energy or mood or digestive system changes, which will then allow you to make more of these lifestyle adaptations that will very positively impact this new microbiome and support you moving forward.
Yeah. And so, we're starting with the pre-treatment, which is taking out or trying to reduce the dysbiosis by removing what shouldn't be there. The loading dose then kind of provides the foundation for what we're going to do. And the maintenance is going to allow for kind of extended seeding, which helps kind of promote the colonization and the stability of this new microbiome. And we have to think about in terms of chronic conditions, which is kind of where a lot of this extended maintenance comes in, is that the gut is tied into a lot of other systems, right? The immune, inflammatory, the gut-brain axis, the gut-liver axis. Every other day, the gut, we learn more about how it's interconnected with more systems within the body. Those systems, if they've been dysregulated for a long period of time, part of this is they also have to re-regulate. They have to get the new healthy signals from the gut, the right building blocks that are coming out of the gut. And so that also takes time. And so we want to allow for that kind of re-regulation to happen and it to be supported as well.
Right. And so examples, I mean, there's a lot of, nuance in how the protocol specifically could be designed, but the concept is fairly simple, right? You're starting out with a larger dose, and that could be with the oral capsules, which is very common for adults who can swallow capsules. We don't have an issue with swallowing capsules, or depending on the condition, it could start out with the rectal enema or a colonoscopy if there's a gastro involved in the protocol. And so with the enema or the colonoscopy, it's the same concept. You're introducing, billions, potentially over 1 trillion bacteria in a single administration of an enema, or in the context of doing a colonoscopy. Same idea with the capsules. It's potentially one bottle over 2 days or one bottle a day for 2 days to really produce and promote a huge amount of bacteria going in, almost in some sense, overwhelming the system in a positive way to push out the bad guys and create this environment where they can come in and take hold. I think it's, there's some approaches where it's like a low dose the whole time, and that could work. It might just require treating over a much longer period of time with this like persistent trying to, overcome the dysbiosis. But I think when the medical history is such that there's a lot of antibiotic use in the past, we know through testing or symptoms that there's a lot of symptoms, and this patient's been ill for an extended period of time. The idea of doing some form of a clean out followed by a bowel prep, which typically just looks like using, a combination of either magnesium citrate, Movi prep, which is just a prep that patients would do in advance of a colonoscopy, higher, like escalating doses of vitamin C. The whole idea is like to clean out. And then that combined with fasting, you're allowing less foods and fiber content to be in the bowel, so that when the patient's doing this loading dose, it's like there's a lot of real estate. There's a lot of places to go. There's not a lot of competition. There's not a lot of stuff that it's in the way, so to speak. And the other reason to do this clean out is also because if the patient is on an antibiotic or antifungal or any other medications to kill stuff off, we're then allowing with that clean out to sort of like push it all out. And, these different bacteria or different antibiotics have different half-lives, and they're going to be in the system for different amounts of time. But generally speaking, the idea is like wash them out so that when we put in this large amount of bacteria, there's not already antibiotics that are still residual within the gut that could be killing or harming this transplant. So that's the general like concept or why behind doing both the antibiotics, the loading dose, but actually prepping the loading dose in such a way that you're cleaning everything out between a bowel cleanse, which is just the point of it is getting to a loose bowel. And Shana, you pointed this out. If the patient already has diarrhea, there's no need to do this bowel cleanse because they're clearing out. Now, there's patients who might start with diarrhea, but if they're doing a pre-treatment, say with an antibiotic, it might actually result in firming up the stools. And so in those cases, it may or may not be necessary to do a bowel cleanse. But then from there, the patient can go into, they may not need it, in which case they can go straight to the loading dose. And that again could be over 1 or 2 days, followed again by maintenance.
Perfect. And then part 2 is when we look into the research a little bit, almost all of the studies are starting with some type of bolus dose. The pre-treatment really depends on the condition. And I think from what I'm kind of seeing consistently, it really seems like if there is recent or recurrent antibiotic use, that kind of determines if antibiotics were used as part of the gut prep. But in cases where, the patient isn't regularly on antibiotics as part of their treatment, antibiotics does seem to be used. And there are a number of studies that kind of show the kind of enhanced engraftment and success by doing this initial gut prep. And then bowel cleanses tend to be pretty consistent across the board. And so I think these are important things to look at when you're building out a protocol and understanding the importance of trying to make this work by making everything in the system easier for it to work, and not putting barriers in the way. And we want to make sure that we're enhancing, how easy it is to have FMT and graft. And by kind of prepping the gut for that, we feel it makes that a little bit easier. And overall, both from experience as well as from the research, it consistently does show better outcomes.
Right. And I think, there's good reason for people to be, hesitant to use antibiotics. I think generally speaking, antibiotics are wildly overused. Public health has been shouting this from the rooftops for a while now. And so generally I am anti-antibiotics, unless of course they're indicated, which there's plenty of reasons to use them, and they can be life-changing and life-saving. So it's not a diss necessarily on antibiotics. It's just that in many cases they're overused. The thing is when you're following antibiotics nearly immediately, right? We're talking like taking 48 to 72 hours as part of this bowel cleanse. You're going to overcome any of the potential negative consequences of otherwise using antibiotics, right? And so it generally, we find patients tolerate them really well, especially if there is dysbiosis. A lot of patients who are going to be great responders for FMT actually do better on an antibiotic, which makes sense, right? If they're dealing with a dysbiotic state or there's some pathogens or significant overgrowth, being on a combination of an antibiotic antifungal can actually result in the patient responding really well. And that's amazing. And so that's the general way of thinking about this. Now, there are examples where patients are like, look, there's no way I'm going on an antibiotic. I have been on way too many of them. I'm in this state because of them, or anytime I go on an antibiotic, I feel horrible. So there's a lot of caveats to this like very general broad rule. And I'll just say that we absolutely have had patients who did no pretreatment other than like a bowel cleanse and a fast. And they still responded well. Not all of them, but it's hard to know, was it because of the pretreatment or not because of the pretreatment? And so I think it's really individual. And as a physician, you have to take it case by case. Of course, if you're doing research, it's like there's group A and there's group B, and you're slotted into either one of them. And then on the other side as well is that if you are, more functional, integrative, practicing more holistically, you may turn to some natural herbal antimicrobials combinations, which could include like garlic or neem or berberine or other versions like that are very potent antifungal, antibacterial compounds that can work very effectively in also neutralizing some of these overgrowths. It's not as well researched, and so it's hard to know, is it doing the same job, say, as an antibiotic? I don't think so. I think you might need to do like higher doses for a longer period of time compared to antibiotics. I mean, it's pretty clear they knock stuff out. We know what they're knocking out. And so I think, taking that more research-based approach, understanding that we're following this up immediately with FMT, I'm generally a proponent in this context of using antibiotics and antifungals.
Right. And then the loading dose is it's somewhere between 1 and 2 days. And then we get into this maintenance dose period. And this is kind of where I think we know a little bit less, because as we kind of open this with, is that we're just now kind of seeing more consistent extended protocols. And this is part of why we do so much extensive research and really understanding how this is being applied and how we're seeing a shift and how it's being applied, so we can get a better understanding of, both more successful outcomes with extended treatment, but what is that extended treatment and what are the measures being used to kind of determine how long this is going to be? And so the way that we have started to approach it in terms of knowing how long is kind of doing these monthly touch points as a suggestion. And so the goal here is having a baseline measure, so some type of validated tracking measure that you implement before starting FMT, and then implementing that same validated measure monthly, so you can actually determine what kind of benefits we're seeing and if they are plateauing. And part of the plateau is understanding why we've plateaued or why we're no longer seeing benefits on benefits, as well as touching in with your patients to understand how are these lifestyle modifications going to ensure that they are, broadening and diversifying their diet and making more healthy lifestyle choices, like adding in, aerobic exercise or really focusing on healthy sleep patterns. And so using these validated measures, and we see these across the board, there's really specific ones that are really tied into specific chronic diseases. And then there's general ones that look at kind of general symptoms. And so, we suggest there's, gastrointestinal ones. There is quality of life measures. There's ones that are specific to symptom improvements tied to some kind of treatment, so that you can look at these measures to see how they're improving. And these are ones that patients often can do at home and then are scored by a healthcare professional, so that you can see numerically how they're changing. And a lot of these have subsets as well. So you can see if there's specific, areas for, gastrointestinal symptoms, is there specific symptoms that were, you're most concerned with, and how are those improving? And that can help indicate how to lengthen your maintenance dose so you can continue to see improvements in those areas. So that's one suggestion in kind of how to determine how long to do this maintenance dose, is using, a data-informed decisions.
Right. And these are validated measures and things that we can share. So if you are a clinician interested in this and want access to those, reach out. We'll be more than happy to share them. These are not measures that we've created. These are validated measures that exist and have been used in research and different studies and so on. And we also use some of these when we were treating patients, because I think data is really, really important. And if you're a clinician or practitioner listening to this, it's very motivating for a patient to be able to see, here's where I've been, here's where I'm at, and here's where I'd like to go. And they will then feel more empowered to take action to make some of these diet and lifestyle changes that we know emphatically are going to support their treatment. And when doing this tracking, the reality is us as humans, thank goodness, but we generally forget about how tough things have been, and what symptoms we've actually been experiencing. And so by doing this tracking, it's a reminder of okay, this is where I was, and this is the percentage improvement I've been seeing over this time. And so it's an encouragement, okay, it potentially is worth continuing. The one thing that I would suggest is there are cases where a patient may hit a bit of a plateau. And so it's important to sort of dig into that a little bit, drill into it, and find out what potentially could be going on. And clinically, what I have seen is in some cases, especially if they've had a history of a lot of fungal overgrowth, there is a potential that there wasn't enough of the seeding of the gut to overcome the fungal overgrowth such that we could get this more significant improvement. And so in those cases, there's really two things to think about. One is what's going on in the diet, making sure that we're not really feeding ultimately sugar that's increasing and feeding this fungus. So whether that's cutting out processed foods and foods that are high in sugar, and even in some cases, moderating the intake of fruit, which, great, it's healthy, but in high amounts of it, if it's easily digestible, like in smoothies and juices and things, we know it's going to feed a fungal overgrowth. So thinking about that perspective, as well as in some cases, we've actually had to put patients on an antifungal at certain points during the treatment to quell that enough, hopefully, so that continued dosing of FMT will overcome this fungal overgrowth. But in many cases, these patients, they've had a history of this. This is not the first time they've had a fungal issue. It's just that in the past, they may have repeatedly, whether through supplements or even antifungal prescriptions, had to manage it that way. So that's one consideration. The other consideration is that some people, the dose may not be sufficient. And so if they did really well originally and they're continuing to improve, they've kind of plateaued, maybe they're even sliding back a little bit. What I would always suggest is, hey, if you're at 1 capsule a day or 1 vial of oral powder per day in the context of a pediatric patient, try increasing it, going from 1 capsule a day to 2 capsules a day, say 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening. And for some people, that can make a world of difference. And so the dose does, in some cases, have an effect. And this is not weight dependent. I've seen this in kids. I've seen this in adults. Sometimes an adult can tolerate 2, or in some cases, they're better off with 1 every other day. So it's really something that you do need to finesse over time, but I wouldn't give up on the treatment if you've plateaued unless you've looked into, okay, what's happening. I mean, at some point you're going to have gotten the benefits from doing the transplant, and the whole context behind FMT is not that you need to take it forever. However, there are cases where it may be beneficial to monitor labs, to monitor symptoms, especially in the context of like really inflammatory autoimmune based conditions where there are specific markers that you can manage, whether it's calprotectin or CRP or other markers that you can say, okay, we're starting to see an increase in some of these inflammatory markers. And so instead of waiting until it's presenting in like overt disease, overt symptoms, let's consider a bolus or a small booster, if you will, of FMT to get this under control and get the patient back on track. Now, a lot of that, typically from what I've seen, coincides with what's going on in the patient's life, right? Maybe they slipped on the diet, they were traveling, they were under a lot of stress, there was under a lot of pressure, sleep was off for a period of time. Like something's generally happened for that to happen, for that to express itself. But that's where, especially in those disease states where it is easy to monitor these inflammatory states, where it could be a good idea to just monitor over time and as needed, do a bit of a booster dose. But the general concept is a defined period of time for the treatment and then revisiting it over time as we're tracking the patient and as the patient's potentially undergoing other treatments.
And so we talked a little bit about the loading doses kind of being these bolus doses, either, 15 caps a day for 2 days or 30 caps per day for 2 days, depending on kind of the condition and the setup. When we go into maintenance, you mentioned, the standard kind of has always been, 1 cap a day for 30 days and then do kind of these evaluations. But as well, in cases where someone can't swallow capsules, we have a patented product that isn't, not everybody has, but we've created specifically targeted towards people who can't swallow capsules. And so the idea here is it's a powder that's, mixed with some type of liquid, water, juice, milk, and then can just be swallowed. And this allows for this maintenance dose to happen even in cases where a capsule can't be swallowed.
Right.
And so that's normally predated with an enema, of course, or a colonoscopy.
Right. And just to highlight, it's substantially colorless, odorless, and tasteless, which is, as you could imagine, quite a feat when you consider the starting source of the product. But really, we've never seen, and again, treating wax of patients, we've never seen problems where tolerating it or palatability were an issue. So that's really a wonderful achievement. And it allows us then in these cases, either in pediatrics but there's even adults who have challenges swallowing capsules, whether it's like, they're dealing with radiation burns or there's just so many potential variables. And so having the ability to mix it with something and just drink it is the option. The caveat generally is just that when you are doing the oral powder, we suggest preceding the treatment with a proton pump inhibitor. So daily they would take that, hour, 45 minutes, something like that, before the actual FMT dose, lower the stomach acid so that more of these microbes are able to pass through the stomach and then get into the small and large bowel. Interestingly, we've looked at our own data when we were treating a lot of cases of pediatrics, especially autism, and we didn't notice any difference between the groups, whether they were doing the oral powder versus the oral capsules. Just thinking about it from like a theoretical standpoint, I would have assumed that the capsule group would potentially have had a better outcome because the capsules are double encapsulated, enteric coated. We know they're not opening up in the small in the stomach. They start opening up in the small and then make their way into the large bowel. And so really encouraging. Maybe there's some microbes that are better off at surviving the stomach acid that then phages and other things that allow them to still get that great benefit and outcome. So that's encouraging from my perspective. Again, like antibiotics, I'm not generally a huge fan of putting patients on proton pump inhibitors, but this is a pros versus cons, right? Like we're trying to get more of these microbes through. It's for a defined short period of time. Generally, they're well tolerated. Of course, there's always exceptions. And then coming off with the proton pump inhibitor, the goal is always to wean off slowly. So you're not just like stopping FMT and then the next, that same day you're stopping the proton pump inhibitor. The idea is to slowly wean down the dose over 1 to potentially 2 weeks, and doing that approach, patients tolerate it very well.
Perfect. So this is kind of the the basic premise of building these protocols. And we kind of have the concept of, acute cases where, something similar to C. diff or someone coming off of antibiotics that, knows that they probably often don't react well to being on antibiotics, something acute, moderate cases, and then chronic cases. And in each of these instances, the suggested to extend maintenance in line with how chronic the condition is. I'll let you add there, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, the very simple rule that I sort of came to understand over years of treating patients is, and this is really true of any chronic disease, is like, if you've been dealing with something for, years, to even in some cases decades, your physiology, your anatomy, like, stuff has changed, and your body is missing signals. It's missing building blocks. There's really ingrained, changes. And that's a part of the symptoms you're experiencing, whether it's hormonal, whether it's neurotransmitters, whether it's gut barrier, whether it's blood-brain barrier, whether it's, what's going on in your physiology from a neurological standpoint, and the neurons and the connections and the synapses. Like, all of this stuff has been impacted as a result of you being ill for this length of time. The organs are affected. Everything begins to be affected. And so in keeping that in mind, it does make sense that it is going to take time. And generally what happens is that first you start to moderate and change the microbiome, the composition of the microbiome. Once that begins happening, the microbiome is behaving and acting differently. It's sending different signals and different metabolites to different parts of the body to allow healing and rewiring. The gut barrier begins to heal up. And so you're getting a significantly reduced leakage, if you will, of inflammatory components into the rest of the body. And so it works generally from like this inside out perspective. First, you start to see the gut improving, whether that's like healthier bowel movements. If it's diarrhea, it's more formed, more regular. If it's constipation, it's, better consistently, more frequent. And so first the changes begin to happen in the digestive system, but slowly they begin to take hold in the rest of the body. And so keeping that in mind, if a patient's been dealing with something that's both severe and very chronic for an extended period of time, this is going to take some time. And I think it's very important to have that conversation up front with the patient. They can't just expect a very short protocol when they've been dealing with something chronically to make that significant difference in such a short time. And maybe they will see a significant improvement in a short time. That happens very frequently. But to really engraft and get this change to happen more permanently, it's going to require treatment over a longer period of time. And so, and how long, it really varies, right? And this is the advantage of doing some of these validated measures to test. And autism is a perfect case in point. I sort of mentioned it earlier, but in the early days, we had, as a sort of research community or clinical, community, sort of assumed like FMT just doesn't seem to work for autism. Doesn't seem to have the benefits that we're seeing in some of the other diseases. But then along came a study from Arizona State University where they were treating for 8 weeks instead of a short period of time. And that was the protocol at a minimum that made the changes that we then began to see in this community of patients. And so very encouraging. But that same thing could be true in other conditions as well, where historically they've been studied and researched with very short defined protocols. And it maybe didn't have the efficacy that we would have otherwise hoped for. But it might not be that the disease state or physiology isn't responding to the treatment. It's just that the treatment's not long enough. And that is really the advantage of using this either oral capsule or oral powder as a maintenance, is that it brings down the cost. It makes it so much easier. You don't want to be repeating enemas all the time or colonoscopies all the time. That, especially in the context of a colonoscopy, it's invasive. It comes with risks. There's other problems. And so having this ability to do an extended maintenance with a capsule or an oral powder, it's an at-home thing. It's very easy for patients to maintain over an extended period of time. And that in these contexts can be necessary. Of course, there's always, the potential that some patient doesn't need that, but that's the general rule of thumb. And so that's the approach to take, is like, especially if a patient's been more chronically ill and the condition is more severe, they may need to treat over a longer period of time.
And I think an important instance here, when we talked about the possibility of kind of needing a top up, we see this in ulcerative colitis, because there's an inflammatory kind of cycle that exists within this disease. You talked about kind of measuring a marker to ensure, and we do see that there are cases, 3 to 6 months after needing a top up, just to kind of keep the maintenance and keep them in remission. And so I think it's important to understand, like, the maintenance dose, it doesn't mean that after the maintenance dose is done that there's no need to kind of monitor and keep checking, even if we see a remission-like state, because it's important to really understand and monitor the patient and see how long. And some of these studies go for up to a year, and we see some that are only a couple of months. And so it's better to understand, like, what's happening over time, and ensure that we're watching for any, especially in autoimmune or cyclical diseases where there's on and off periods, to just make sure that everything is staying maintained.
Right. And this is the importance of, as well, like during FMT, following FMT, that you're protecting and respecting the microbiome, right? It became imbalanced for some reason. I mean, maybe you were born via C-section and you had a bunch of antibiotics as a child and teenage. I mean, there's so many potential variables, but regardless of how you got here, you have dysbiosis, you've got imbalance. And so it's important to make sure that you're not repeating the things that got you to where you currently are, right? And so if you go back on antibiotics, or your diet becomes really, imbalanced and not diverse, you're drinking a lot of alcohol, maybe using some drugs, who knows? Whatever's going on, you're damaging your gut microbiome. And just the fact of living on this planet, it's unavoidable. I mean, there's toxins in foods and the waters and the air. I mean, we're constantly being exposed to things that are potentially damaging to the gut microbiome. Aging is just results in damage to the gut microbiome. I mean, it's hard to escape. And so it is important to watch and potentially do booster treatments over time if needed. Now, if the patient's very diligent about, making sure they're watching their diet, making sure they're exercising and getting the right sleep and all of these like perfect things, maybe they don't need it for a long period of time, and that's phenomenal. But in these cases, as you pointed out, where there's a real strong inflammatory basis to the disease, it's an autoimmune picture. It's not to say that it can't be overcome permanently. It's just that you need to be monitoring and watching it just to make sure. And that's the same thing that, doctors are doing in the case of cancer patients, right? Like, if you had cancer once, and you're going to be at an increased risk of having it again. And so instead of just ignoring the fact, oh, I'm clear of cancer, like I'm done. No, they still follow up and test at a certain frequency. And then if, the follow-up test at 6 months is clear, and then they do it again at a year, that's clear. They're like, okay, maybe I'll do that at 2 years. And then if that 2 years is still clear, maybe we'll do it at 4. So they keep spreading it out, right? And so a lot of it will depend on the type of disease, the type of symptoms you're experiencing, how you're responding, what your diet and lifestyle is like. So all of these factors weigh in to the ultimate approach to how to design and support a patient long-term.
Yeah. And to highlight, we talk about diet a lot. And if you've watched a lot of our other videos, diet comes up a lot. And I think it's important to understand that changing your diet has more impact on the composition of the gut microbiome than your genetics do. So this is a tangible thing you can change to improve the gut or help maintain a healthy gut. And so diet diversity plays a really big role here. And it's such a big factor, and we'll continue to talk about it a lot because it plays such a big role. And we start seeing shifts caused by diet 24 to 48 hours after that change happens. So it happens quickly. That's both a positive and a negative. Because if you eat unhealthy for a couple of days, well, the changes have already started to happen. And one of the things about having a really healthy, stable, diverse gut microbiome is it's able to overcome those things. And so it's not about doing, one mistake and all this work is gone, but being aware of the role that diet has. The same with, sleep plays a really big role. And both diet and sleep together will impact things like mood and stress, and your desire to be physically active. If you're not sleeping well and you're eating really poorly, where's the energy coming from, to do the other healthy choices? And so we talk about diet a lot because diet's really important. And getting, I think, everyone to understand, if you're putting this new healthy environment into your body and you want it to grow, well, you have to feed it. And there's so many different microbiota in the gut they need to be fed by many different things. And so we talk about, expanding the diet in terms of diversity is really key, because you're now feeding things that may not have been there before, but they need to stay there. And to do that, they have to be fed.
Yes. And then the one thing that we didn't touch on is just considering the supplements, right?
Yeah,
If there may be supplements that have, as we've talked about from the pre-treatment standpoint, that are more antimicrobial in basis. And so from a food perspective, there's no need to worry. You can eat foods like garlic and the other things that are considered anti-inflammatory or antibacterial or antimicrobial in general. So foods, not a worry. The issue becomes in these supplements, which can have really high doses, and they're extracting the compounds that are like allicin, for example, in garlic. That's what's responsible for the antimicrobial approach. Well, in one capsule, you might have like the equivalent of 30 to 100 cloves of garlic. Well, I don't know anybody who's eating that much in a serving. And if you are, I'm impressed. But assuming you're not, and you're just a normal human being who might add a couple as a part of a meal, it's not going to create a problem. In fact, there's a lot of benefits to using those compounds in foods. So the rule, though, generally is take a look at the supplements. We mentioned it in the guide as well, given a broad overview of potential supplements or herb combinations that you might want to watch, just to ensure you're not over time slowly degrading the microbiome. Now, generally, herbs are more, they're not like an antibiotic where they just kill everything. They're more, balancing. And so there's potentially some benefits, but people sometimes just do, every quarter I do like an anti-parasitic protocol. Well, that may not be necessary, and it may cause some damage or harm. Same with probiotics. We generally suggest avoiding those during the FMT treatment and potentially even avoiding them after. And the emphasis is really on the diet as the number one thing to focus on and getting a lot of diversity there. And then the other part is focusing on the lifestyle and other factors that we know support a healthy gut and microbiome.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about probiotics, we're not talking about probiotics in food. Again, food is good. Eat lots of food and different diverse foods. But when we're talking about taking probiotics while you're doing FMT, these are really concentrated and of a handful of strains. And we don't want it to, because while the probiotics are actively being taken, they do have impacts in the gut. But because they're transient, if you stop taking the probiotics, you lose those things. And this has been shown kind of across the board that probiotics work while you take them. Because they don't engraft, you kind of lose those benefits. Well, while we're trying to seed a gut, you don't want there to be competition from probiotics, and when you stop taking the probiotics, you kind of left a gap in what could have been seeded by the FMT. That's how I think of it, as a way to kind of explain why we're trying to avoid this, because we don't want there to be competition, or for the gut to think that that's already covered in terms of creating a community. And then when you stop taking the probiotics, there's a gap there that isn't filled.
Right. And that's the key distinction, right? A probiotic has a transient benefit in the gut, but doesn't seed, it doesn't engraft into the gut. So we don't want the gut thinking, if it's doing such a thing, they're like, I've got enough of these. Like, I don't need to worry about implanting and engrafting because there's plenty of them around. Instead, we want to, have the right composition. As I've mentioned several times, it's all about the balance. Everything in the body is about balance. The pH of the blood, the neurotransmitter balance, like everything comes down to balance. If you've got, there's TH1 and TH2 in the immune system. If you're pushing one more than the other, problem. So everything in our bodies, in the world, in our lives really does come down to balance. And so it's really critical that we're representing what is a healthy, balanced microbiome, which is coming from the donors, and not tilting the scales to something that isn't balanced. And then wondering like, wait a minute, why aren't we getting the benefits, right? Because we're pushing something that is inherently imbalanced, and we want to avoid that. So that's the general concept and approach. And I hope this training and talk and podcast was interesting, informative. We really want to speak with and learn and help educate other doctors, clinics, and researchers if they're out there. So reach out, do engage with us, leave a comment on the video. We love to see those, and that can guide conversations and videos and other types of content that we put out. So So we really appreciate when people do engage and spend the time to reach out. And otherwise, personally, I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.
Thank you for joining us. And we, as always, subscribe, press the bell, subscribe to the podcast, do all of the computering so that you don't miss the next episode. And if you have something we talked about today you wish we jumped into more, or if you have an interesting topic that you would like us to dive into, please leave a comment or send us an email so that we can cover that next time. Thank you so much, and we will see you on the next one.